I share my screen and get started?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, let's see. Well, first of all, I'm so honored to be here today and to speak with so many students. I'm going to do a presentation, a few slides, or like quite a few slides. But I would really like to have a big discussion and Q&A also. So I hope that I leave enough room for that. I will check the time. So a little introduction. I'm going to talk about inclusive journalism and the question actually of how media organizations and journalists can do a better job in representation. My name is Sanne Breimer. I'm a Dutch journalist and press critic. I work remotely from Southeast Asia, actually, from the last 2.5 years. At this moment, I'm in the cold Netherlands, but I hope to return to Southeast Asia, Indonesia, particularly in November. And I've been working in public broadcasting for most of my career in the Netherlands. And I will also share some of my work in this presentation. So before we start, I would like to ask you guys a few questions. So it's not necessarily something that you need to answer, but it's more a few things that I want you to give some thought for a few seconds. So first of all, if you think about your own gender, would you identify as a man or a woman? Or would you identify as gender fluid or transgender? So if you think about the topic of gender, if you think about your own person, give it some thoughts which gender you would identify with. And then the next question I'd like to ask, I'll just ask them a little bit quickly. If we talk about social class, so your professor was already mentioning the caste system in India. If you would have to put yourself in the social order, would you say you're part of the upper class, or would you say you're part of the lower class, or maybe middle class, or in between? So if you look at you as a person, maybe you come from a family that's from a different class than the class you're in now, which for caste system is maybe a little bit more complicated. But if you look at how you're financially situated, it can be different than from the family you grew up in. And then if we talk about race and skin color, if you look at yourself and think about the color you identify with and the racial background, which would it be? And is this something that makes you the majority of your society, or does it mean that you're the minority in your society? Did you ever think about the position you have? And then the next one, I think the slides is not completely visible, but or not a complete slide. But if you look at the political spectrum, from the far left to the far right, where would you, as a journalism student, position yourself? Would it be in the center, or more to the right, more to the left? Is this something that you thought of, or is this something that you actually don't think plays a role in your work as a journalist? And then the next question is about the city or the rural area. So are you now living in a city area, in an urban area, or do you live in a rural area, maybe suburban? Is this something that changed over the years? Did you grow up maybe in a rural area and live now in a city, or are you a majority of the society living in a rural area, or are most of the people in your country living in the city? So think about it and think about your position. And another one, religion and spirituality. What is your religion at this moment? What is your spirituality? Or maybe your you're not one of them, or you don't belong to a spiritual context, or you don't identify with one of the religions, but maybe you do. And this is also something that's something to think about. And then the last one is about disability. So do you yourself have a disability, or is it someone in your family who has a disability, or you have friends? Is it a physical disability or mental disability? And again, is this something that you thought of in your job as a journalist? And then those were the questions I want to ask you. So I hope you did some thinking about that for yourself. The reason why I ask it has everything to do with what I want to share about inclusion and decoloniality today, because often we as journalists, and I'm talking obviously from a European Dutch perspective, we tend to put ourselves outside of the world. We tend to observe what is happening from a kind of neutral position, whereas we're not neutral, and we can be as objective as possible, but we as journalists also have a position in our societies and in this world. So instead of putting ourselves outside of this planet, we need to be aware of the fact that we also have a certain position on this planet. And that's why I wanted to ask you to think about these questions. Objectivity actually is the view of the dominant group. And that's a decolonial perspective. But if you think about it, if you think about media diversity, if you think about inclusion, objectivity becomes an interesting topic to discuss, because most of the time, if a newsroom is not really diverse, the objective perspective is most of the time the perspective of the dominant group in the newsroom.
You are here for 6 months.
Yeah.
I think the audio somewhere is on, but I will continue. If you then look at journalism, for example, the global pandemic, these are two news pictures. On the left, you see a news picture of mass cremation in your country, in India. And on the right, you see hoarding of toilet paper in the West, in the US and Europe. So if you position yourself as a journalist, you might want to, from a European perspective, you might want to choose the left picture, because in itself, seeing a cremation is already something that is not really often seen like this. And it says something about the position you have as a journalist to choose this picture. Whereas it's the exact same topic, right? But it gives a total different idea of what is happening. And this is just an example. It's not really about what is right or what is wrong. It's just to think about what choice you make as a journalist. This is, again, the same topic. Two different parts of the world. Again, your country, India, or some of your, I just hear that there are more students from different countries in this session, and then the US, Europe. So if you would be an Indian journalist, you might want to choose a more human approach to the news, which then makes it more equal to how journalists in the West report on their own countries. So that's an example of content, an example of perception. What I want to say with this is that media really shape our perspective. And that's something that as journalists, we need to be constantly aware of, especially if we're talking about inclusion in journalism. And I really love this drawing because you can see that what is happening here is that the guy who is filming, what you see on the little screen is actually the opposite of what is happening in real life in the situation that he's filming. So that is, of course, extreme example, but this is how important it is to be aware of how we as journalists shape the perspective of people. So I want to take you back to Black Lives Matter, because I just talked about a global pandemic. And during 2020, Black Lives Matter protests became also a global issue, starting with the killing of George Floyd in the US. And this picture shows the Fair and Lovely brand in India. And you all know better than me that they changed the name in Good and Lovely because it raised some questions about the word fair in this skin whitening cream. But I chose this picture just to show that the Black Lives Matter protest was also a global issue. And always when systemic racism comes a news topic, we see that the next thing that is happening is the discussion in media about media diversity and representation. We suddenly realize again that the newsrooms in the West, for example, are mostly white. In India, it's more a case of a lot of upper castes that are mostly dominant in newsrooms. So I found this report of Oxfam in India with a few numbers. That says that most journalists in newsrooms are from the upper caste. So there's a really big diversity problem in journalism in India as well. And the thing is that when something like Black Lives Matter happens in society, we suddenly as news organizations talk about it again. And I say suddenly because I've been working in inclusive media for a long time, and I noticed that we're actually talking in circles. So something is happening in the news. Systemic racism issue is happening in the news. We talk about it. I call it blah, blah, blah nowadays. Because we discuss it, we come up with certain solutions, but the result is that the changes are really only happening on the surface level. For example, we hire some people from different castes maybe, or different color in the West. Most of the time, these people don't feel like they belong in the newsroom, so they will leave very fast also. So the changes are going really slow and only happening on the surface level. And that's why I use the image of the tree, because we need to go to the root level of the problem. And that's why I focus on inclusion in journalism. And parts of the root solutions are, for example, long-term strategy on inclusion, doing more self-reflection. For example, thinking about the position you as a journalist have in society, and also the topic of decoloniality. And I will talk a little bit about this soon. But this is really to show that media diversity is not a new topic. I think in my country, in the Netherlands, we've been talking about it already for 3 or maybe even 4 decades. And it's the same discussion all the time. And I've noticed through experience that the root level solutions are almost never really touched, because a lot of times it's also very uncomfortable to talk about it. And so from my own experience, I know it has a lot to do with the fact that self-reflection is not often being done in media. Really looking in a mirror to ourselves, what can we do different? Often in the Netherlands, if we talk about diversity in the newsrooms, we think that the solution needs to come outside of our own newsroom and not so much from inside. So I would really emphasize that everyone needs to do the work themselves and look critically in the mirror and see what you can change about your own biases and prejudices. So a little bit about how that worked for me. I've been working in national broadcasting, in public broadcasting in the Netherlands for almost 15 years. So most of my years, I worked at a radio station, which was called Phonics Radio. And you see me a few years ago in the red circle. And Phonics Radio is still existing very successfully, multicultural radio station. So I was working with colleagues from different cultural backgrounds. And it taught me a lot as a white woman about my prejudices and biases. And I learned all these things while working for 10 years in this organization. And a funny thing, we at some point also launched phonics Dizzy with Indian music. So I thought it's nice to mention that here as well. But these pictures are from my own background. So even though I was working in a very multicultural urban radio station focusing on youth in the big cities of the Netherlands, I myself come from a very remote village with only 700 inhabitants in the north of the Netherlands. So on the left, you see the harbor, the oldest harbor of Europe, actually, which is very close to my where I'm staying, where I grew up. Actually, I'm not staying there anymore. So it has now one boat, but it's the oldest harbor of Europe. In the middle, you see the hat that my grandmother used to wear when she was younger. And on the right, you see the typical flag of my region with the cookies in the supermarkets. So just to let you know that I come from a completely different, much more rural area than the organization that I used to work in. And these are my parents and also my uncle. And I wanted to share this picture with you because while I worked in this very multicultural radio organization, I learned so much about my prejudices and biases being a white woman in the Netherlands. And not everyone goes through that same experience. So now when my uncle is visiting on the left and the discussions we have at the coffee table about diversity and inclusion are not always easy, because I feel that my perception has broadened through my experience. And I noticed that their experience coming from their framework in a rural area with only white people in the Netherlands is completely different. But discussing this with your own family, these changes in society, is so important. So I became very aware of the fact that I'm white, and it might sound weird, but if you were in India or in any other country, part of the majority of your country, you're always the default in society, right? So you don't really have to think about your cultural backgrounds unless you become in contact with other people. And that only happens if you really work together, or sometimes it doesn't happen at all because you live your whole life in a very homogeneous environment. So I became very much aware through my work as a journalist of the fact that I'm a white woman from Europe. And that brings with me a lot of privileges. And I noticed that a lot of my colleagues were just talking about really different topics and were also looking in a very different way to society than I was. And if you look at that from a root level, you would go back to actually the colonial history and the time that Europe became the center of the world. If you nowadays look at the world map, you will see that Europe most of the time is in the center of the world map, which gives you some idea of what it would look like if we would look at the world from a different point of view. So this map, for example, is asking the question, why is the North always at the top of the map? Well, it's because of our history that the north of the world became such an important and rich and powerful part of our planet. This, for example, if we want to change the perspective, is the globe for fish. I just shared it in social media the other day. I found it on the internet. These kind of images are interesting to think about. You know, there's one way to look at the world, but there are many other ways also which we don't always think about. So being a white woman in Europe in a privileged society, for many decades also gave journalism the idea that we should report, go to other countries, report about what is happening there in a way that we arrive in a country, parachute ourselves into a country, coming from this white dominant framework, reporting in a country that we don't really know exactly the context. And that again shapes the perspective of a lot of people who are watching the news. And parachute journalism is one of the things that is still happening, and is, I think, also one of the topics that we should discuss, especially in the West, more often. Like, why would we parachute ourselves into other countries if there are already very equipped journalists working there who can probably tell the stories much better than we can from our framework? So this also has to do with colonialism. I was mentioning it already. So the history of colonialism created the Europe and the US as a very dominant part of the world. And with colonialism comes also the silencing of other narratives. So inclusion and decoloniality in journalism is a lot about silencing certain stories. And what we actually want to do now, what is actually the goal of the work I'm doing also, is just to not turn back time or imagine that colonialism didn't happen, but just see what we can highlight that has been silenced for such a long time. And this is one of the examples of the fact that the structure that has been created through colonialism is still happening. So vaccine apartheid, it's called. I think there's some discussion about the word apartheid also, but this at least shows how the powerful Europe is still using the power also to keep inequality in place. I mean, it's not this black and white always, but I think this image is just an example of, you can still see the power of Europe in this image. And this is a very current challenge with the pandemic still going on. So a decolonial approach to media is very much connected to inclusive journalism, and it's very much about positionality. So we started this session with asking yourself a few questions. The question is, who is writing which story? Who is speaking in the story? And the relationality is about the we and not the I. So also knowing that we're not neutral in society, we also have a place, and we need to connect with community to tell the right stories. And the third element is the transition. So also realizing there is not one fixed universal truth, there's not one fixed worldview. And I think this is an interesting topic for journalists to discuss, because the fact that we go on and on about media diversity without really changing something is not about the fact that we lack certain knowledge, right? It's most of the time the courage to understand what we already know, and also the courage to discuss the more vulnerable and sensitive topics. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it is kind of necessary. So as I was saying, it's not, the goal of my work is not to turn back time. I mean, we have a history in this planet altogether. We have certain challenges that are becoming global challenges now, but there are some cracks in the system that we live in that we can use to plant certain seeds and do a few different things. And in media, I think these cracks are, for example, smaller initiatives, and I choose these ones from your country or from India because I'm a very big fan of some of the initiatives happening in India. One of them is the media platform Cabalaria, if I pronounce it in the right way. So I know this initiative for 1.5 years now. It's rural news told from a feminist perspective. I think the ingredients they use to really bring very good journalism, but at the same time create a very strong community around the work they're doing, is a really good example of how you can work very inclusively. And another example is People Like Us Create, Plug TV, which I also collaborate with in India. And they highlight people to tell their own stories. And they really also, how to say, educate people to become creators, people sometimes outside of journalism. So I think these are great examples of how inclusive journalism can be done in the right way. Another one is the people of rural India. They won some awards also this year. I think they're doing a very good job as well. I chose their Instagram account because I think they're also making very intelligent use of social media to tell important stories. So these cracks in media are smaller initiatives focusing on more a niche audience, bringing some cracks in the dominant media ecosystem that can change our profession for the better. And journalists can learn from these initiatives. And I call these, brought some of the characteristics of all these companies together in an article I wrote a year ago called The 6 Characteristics of Inclusive Journalism. I'm just going to briefly highlight them, and then I'd love to hear from you guys as well. So what is really important in inclusive journalism is a long-term strategy, not just hiring one person from a lower caste or a different skin color, but bring inclusion in the foundation of your media company, and think about a long-term strategy. Also think about the fact that you will lose certain audience if you are not focusing on inclusion right now. Second characteristic is the being conscious of your unconscious bias. So this has everything to do also with the questions that I was asking you in the beginning. Where do you position yourself? And if you are from a dominant group in society, are you aware of your blind spots and prejudices? That's a very important question. Community engagement. When I was working for the radio station, a multicultural radio station, our motto would be to create content for our audience, but the audience would also be working for us. So we would be the people who we would create content for, so that we would mirror our audience in our newsroom. And I think this community engagement is so important. And sometimes journalists are a little bit afraid of becoming too friendly with their audience, as if you cannot be critical anymore. But I know the opposite is true. It's so important to create a very trustworthy relationship with your audience, and you can still be critical. The fourth one is enlighten, not just inform. So this is also very much connected to the topic of solutions journalism. People are sometimes tired of the news because journalists like to report on everything that goes wrong. Whereas we could also highlight the attempts of creating solutions. It doesn't mean that we as journalists have to come up with solutions ourselves, but we can do some more constructive reporting to keep the audience interested. Decoloniality, I was saying it already. I think it's very important to go back to the root causes of certain challenges we face regarding systemic racism in our society. And a lot of it stems from colonial times. So having a bigger awareness about that and also educating our audience about that can help understand a lot of news topics much better. and then a holistic approach, and realizing that everything in the end of the day is connected. So I was today in a session with journalists from Africa, and we were discussing climate change. Climate change is a typical topic also that really is connected to inequality in the world, but also connected to politics, economics, finance, gender issues. So it's so important to approach the topics in a holistic way. And those are the characteristics of inclusive journalism. And what we did in the beginning to give some thought about, where do you position yourself? Are you a man or a woman? How many people in the newsroom are from a certain religious background? Inclusion is a lot about data also. Just start counting today. What is the amount of people from certain political backgrounds, religious background, gender, all these kind of aspects. It's not so hard to create a difference, but data can really help you doing that. And this is an inspirational quote I found from Audre Lorde, who was also an activist from the US on the topic of decoloniality. And she says, "I'm doing my work. Are you doing yours?" And that's again pointing out to yourself. If you want to start inclusion in your work as a journalist, it's really important to have a critical look in the mirror and see what you can do by starting with your own work. It's easy to point to others, but one finger you point to others, three will point to yourself. So that's the end of my presentation. And I'd love to also learn more from your questions and your maybe experiences also on the topic of inclusion and decoloniality in your country. I run a newsletter. You can subscribe through this link. And I also post frequently on Instagram about this topic. So you're very welcome to follow me there as well. Thank you very much. And please ask your questions.
Yeah, all right. Guys, who wants to go first? You can just raise your hand and just go ahead, please. Hello? All right, let me ask you then. Okay, can I?
Yeah.
I'll ask you. So compared to India, so you're relatively, it seems you're very familiar with what's happening in terms of diversity in Indian newsrooms. So how would you compare that with the situation in Europe in terms of ethnic minorities and others, the representation of ethnic minorities in the newsroom in Europe compared to India?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on what is happening in India, but I do think that if we talk about inclusion, we can see kind of the same power imbalances. So I guess in India, it's more from what I also read from the Oxfam report, it's more about upper class in the newsrooms, right? Or upper caste also. And in the Netherlands, it will be also more or more white people. But I think what I learned also from other cultural backgrounds, also in the Netherlands, is that in my culture, journalism is seen as kind of this profession that is kind of tough, or you know, you don't have to be embarrassed to be a journalist, whereas sometimes in other cultures families rather have you studying to become a doctor or a lawyer, or that might sometimes be a little bit higher in, yeah, how to say, more popular to become instead of becoming a journalist. So that sometimes is also a challenge in media diversity. When I was working in a multicultural company, we would hire people, but we would not always hire people from a journalistic background, because the media or the, how to say, journalism education in the Netherlands would not be so multicultural, because a lot of people from other cultural backgrounds would not necessarily choose journalism as a profession or an education. But it means that you need to be creative and think about other places where you can find these people. And I think that challenge might be the same in India as well. You want more diversity in your newsroom, but the people you want in your newsroom can maybe be people that not automatically choose journalism as a profession. It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't want to work as a journalist, but this also comes down to the certain framework you use when you're hiring people, right? So, yeah, I'm not sure if that's going on in India, but I can imagine that sometimes these aspects also play a role.
And how news organizations in Europe are trying to overcome the lack of representation of women, particularly in leadership positions. Because here in India, if you look at our college, and say my school, we have actually predominantly women's, girl students, but we don't see that reflected in leadership positions and decision-making positions. And so, if you look at the newsrooms, okay, they might claim that okay, we are represented by 50% of women, but it's very hard to find women in leadership positions. So, is it the same case in Europe?
Yeah, I think we have the challenge in Europe as well, for sure. That's, I think, diversity, inclusion. I mean, gender is often the first topic to address, right? What I saw, I think, what I saw when I was working in at Phonics Radio, was working as an editor-in-chief for quite a lot of years. And I noticed in salary negotiations, women would never ask for a raise, for example. I would sometimes tell the women, like, okay, and now you have to ask me for a raise, yeah, like you need to do that for the next conversation we have, or next negotiation. I think this might be also something that is globally maybe the same, that women just need to sometimes learn more better negotiation. And also in the Netherlands, a lot of women work part-time. They don't want to work full-time. So then the discussion needs to be, can you be editor-in-chief while not working full-time, for example? Or, should there be a change in the culture of the organization to make that happen? Or should more women be able to work full-time? And obviously there's the patriarchal issue as well, right? For us women to get a chance, we need also men to advocate for more women power. So yeah.
Yeah, guys, you can ask now.
So can I go ahead?
Yeah, sure, please.
Yes.
Hi. So in the 6 characteristics of inclusive journalism, you talked about how one must, like, as a journalist, one must enlighten rather than inform an audience, right? So how does one strike a balance between this enlightening rather than informing without coming off as patronizing to one's audience?
Yes, that's a very good question. I think in general, journalists are a little bit afraid of patronizing, are a little bit afraid of, at least if I'm talking about journalists in my country, for example, or also a little bit afraid of becoming too activist on certain topics. Whereas I think that when I talk, for example, to journalists in a country like Malaysia, they would say activism and journalism are the same thing. So it also depends on the context of your country. What I mean with enlighten and not just inform is very much related to constructive journalism and also solutions journalism that's being discussed now more. And it's not so much about you as a journalist finding a solution to a certain topic, but it is about you also doing some research about what solutions already have been on the table, and that you can also give a little bit of bigger context to certain topics, explaining people that there is light at the end of the tunnel, and there are some options that things can go towards a solution maybe. And it doesn't have to be your standpoint as a journalist saying it should be this and this solution, but you could shine a light on certain solutions that have been discussed already. So that's what I mean with enlighten, not just inform. And I think we shouldn't be too afraid as journalists also to take a certain position and a certain standpoint in this issue. I hope that answers your question.
Yep.
Yeah, who's next?
Ma'am.
Yes. Hello.
Okay, ma'am, so my question is that like the new media is now getting like famous, and it's like being used by most of our generation. So and it doesn't see racism. It includes everyone, like maybe black and white. I didn't see that. And even the upcoming generation is also accepting the new media more than the mainstream media. I think one of the reason is that too. Like, how can you describe it in your way? Like, if in future maybe mainstream media will take it as a challenge, and they can, get pressurized to include people of any age, of any caste, of any relation for that. Like, how will you relate to this thing? Right?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I'm actually also quite positive about all the changes that are happening coming from a more younger generation, and media initiatives that sometimes only exist on social media, media initiatives that are mostly using Instagram or Facebook to share the news with people. So I think that's a very good thing. At the same time, you also see that the bigger news, the mainstream media is not becoming less powerful. So I think it's interesting what you're saying about mainstream media probably at some point also needs to include these new initiatives. But then it's going to be interesting to see if the system that the mainstream media is built upon, if that is still going to proceed in the future, incorporating these new initiatives, but shaping them in a way that nothing really is going to change. That is going to be really the challenge, I think. And I realize that it even sounds a little bit abstract in a way that I'm saying it right now, but I do think that if you as, for example, a new media initiative using a lot of social media, for example, and new ways to create an audience, and you're very multicultural and it's not so much an issue anymore, and then the mainstream media wants to work together with you, you need to be very aware of the fact that something is also changing in a root level of these organizations, and you're not just becoming this side project that is going to be used and swallowed up in the future, if you know what I mean. I do think it's a good, it's good that this is happening. I mean, it's also something you cannot stop from happening, but if we, media diversity is being discussed for decades already, and the change is really slow. And you just notice that when even big organizations want to change something, often it results in minor changes, and that's just kind of a challenge that we need to work with in the future. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much again.
You're welcome.
Yeah, who wants to go
Ma'am.
next? Yeah, please.
Sir, can I go ahead?
Sure, please.
Yes.
Ma'am, what do you think citizen journalism is being a barrier for inclusive journalism? Do you think is it a barrier?
No, a barrier, you say? No, I don't. Not at all. I actually think that citizen journalism can be very good, or can be a very strong part also of becoming more inclusive. So I should maybe also emphasize that I came up with inclusive journalism to just use a certain terminology of what I'm focusing on, but I'm not saying that I might even change the name in a few months from now. I've been thinking about that already, because I don't want to preach for a different kind of journalism. I think it's really about going back also to the root of the profession and just doing really good journalism. And what I think is very important though of citizen journalism is also the engagement with the community, right? And letting certain people tell their own stories. And I think that is really important for the future of journalism, that we as journalists, we had this decades-long time that in the newsroom we had so much power because we would print a newspaper or we would make a television or radio broadcast and everybody would listen to it. And nowadays in digital times, people there's so much content to consume, so a lot of people don't even know anymore if it's coming from a journalism organization or not. But this also means that we as journalists need to engage more with our audience also to create a trustworthy relationship. Otherwise, they will easily find their contents, how to say, at organizations that don't really apply the journalism ethics. And I think citizen journalists let people tell their own stories, but us as journalists, using our skills to, for example, do the right research, do the right fact check, and then create very strong journalistic stories of the input of our community. I think there lies a big role. One journalist that I really admire is Yusuf Omar, and maybe you know him as well. He has also Indian roots, but he grew up in South Africa. I think he's living in Australia now with his wife Sumaya Omar. They set up #OurStories. And Yusuf would say, I know them both personally, and he would say a few years ago that curation is the new creation. I think in journalism, we already have so many stories. We don't really need so many new content, but a very important role for a journalist can be to do the curation of content and to guide our audience through the overwhelmingly amount of content out there, and telling them what is good content and what is not, or, you know, and that also comes down to citizen journalism, guiding people in telling better stories and using our journalism skills to do that. I think that's very helpful. Long answer.
Thank
Who's
you.
next? Who's next?
Yes, I see a raised hand.
Yeah. Go ahead, Ajay.
So when you talk about the representation, I would like to bring your attention towards the representation of class and language, the intersectionality that lies within the media, and the way the media creates elitism and against this inclusivity which we are talking about. So I want to ask, what methods and approaches, what tools do you think are essential in order to break this colonial mindset and in order to attain equality in the media? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So you were saying about yeah, I understand your question. The language differences also, yeah. Concrete tools there are quite a lot of concrete tools. One platform in the Netherlands, for example, that is really much focusing on decolonial journalism, for example, published a language tool, or actually like a word list for other journalists to use also, where they explain certain colonial language that they are not going to use anymore. So they have a whole list of Dutch words, it's in Dutch, certain colonial terminology, and they publish this and say, in our publication, we're not going to use this colonial language anymore. And I think this is one of the examples of a very concrete tool that helps you in publication to be more inclusive for other people. As for the topic of language, we had a really brief chat before I started this presentation about the fact that in India also more and more smaller news organizations are starting to publish in different languages, right? Not just English anymore. So I think offering your news in different languages is a very important thing. I think in public broadcasting in the Netherlands, it's even in the media law to do so, to be accessible for different languages, but it's not happening so much yet. But yeah, you could nowadays with new technology, you could make these things also more easily accessible with the new technology to translate certain audio, for example, making things accessible through translations online. So yeah, these are, for example, tools that you can use to do that. If we talk about decoloniality, I mean, it's not something that will change overnight. What I experience also studying decoloniality, and from my own experience as working as a white woman in a multicultural media organization, it really has to do with the work you put in it yourself. And it has a lot to do with changing your own perspective. Also being uncomfortable, you know, honestly, I've been very uncomfortable in the years that I was working for the media organization. It was not always fun to be confronted with my prejudices and biases, but you need to be also willing to, yeah, confront certain, how to say, certain opinions you have. And I think becoming aware of the fact that you grow up in a certain framework, becoming aware of the fact that you have a certain position in society is a first important step. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah,
I see.
I feel more or less it's going to like bring in more transparency, and we are going to hear more voices and more experiences the more the language barrier breaks down.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think so too. I think it's just that, you know, the hard thing with this topic is once you see a different perspective, it's hard to unsee, right? Because it changed your perspective already. When you don't see it, it's also very hard to acknowledge that there's a problem. And I see that with a lot of white journalist in the Netherlands, I mean, I've been working in a very multicultural environment, but a lot of people have not. So if you then have not really experienced a certain change of perspective, it's very hard to explain that there is a problem. So I think the awareness is becoming more and more, but it's really important that we don't just discuss or talk about the topic, but that we really, as journalists, also do an effort to give ourselves a different experience that becomes an embodiment, actually. And then it becomes a new truth for ourselves. Instead of just talking about it, letting it be something rational, something, you know, from the books to discuss, because if we keep it in that on that level, things will really not really change. So it's also in a journalism education, for example, you guys as students, it would be great if you discuss this topic maybe monthly in a session, and also bring in your own personal experiences and dare to be a little bit uncomfortable also about this topic, because it's really not an easy topic. But you really learn the most when you yourself become very much, how to say, confronted with it. So it's not an easy thing to do, but it's very worthwhile.
One more thing, the last thing I'd like to call out is that I feel that language goes hand in hand with the class, with the elitism that it creates.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Hello, ma'am. So my
Hello.
question is, hi. So my question is, we spoke about representation of people, equal representation or better representation of people. So my question is, how do we as journalists ensure that there is no misrepresentation of people? Because that happens too in the mainstream media sometimes. So how do we ensure that there is no misrepresentation of any community or a gender or a religion? How do we ensure that?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think you ensure it by communicating very closely to the community you're representing. So I think what is very interesting about this question is what is often discussed in the topic of inclusion nowadays, in the Netherlands at least, is some Black journalists in the Netherlands say, for example, that some topics can only be reported on by Black people. And that's interesting, right? Because a lot of white journalists will then say, what do you mean? Why can I not report on a certain issue? And I think the answer lies somewhere in between, because you don't want to misrepresent a certain community. And that often still happens if you report on a community that you're not coming from yourself. Does it mean that you cannot report on that community? I don't think so. I think you should be able to report on every single topic in the world, but be aware of your own position. So don't report on a certain community as if you are this neutral, objective person, because you're not. Right? And if you are aware of the fact that you report on this community from your position in society, you will also gain much more respect from that community. You can still be critical about certain things, but you need to understand that because of the fact that you come from a certain framework and a certain position, you also come from a certain bias, right? So you're not this neutral and objective person reporting on a community. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anything more? Anybody else?
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah,
Yes.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, so in terms of like, as journalists, we have this pressure, like we have to be, or we are told that we have to be objective. So what I feel is that what sometimes happens is that we kind of have to put like we, in our writing style, we kind of end up giving equal weightage to do opinions, even though the opinions come from different communities that belong to different power structures, and the consequences might be like really different. So how do we as journalists kind of take care of that in our writing, and how do we kind of balance as getting a diversity of opinions, but also kind of telling our readers the reality of like where these opinions are coming from?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not even sure if I have a straight answer, or I have an answer to that, but I'm not sure if I have a solution to that, because nowadays, for example, in Netherlands, it's happening a lot as well. For example, in the vaccine debates, where journalism programs will invite an anti-vax person and someone who is pro-vaccine. And then the debate in media will also be about, like, this is not an equal debate. But I do think that sometimes it also comes from the idea that we as journalists want to sharpen certain story, and we then think that we need the pro and against people in the same discussion, whereas it's not always necessary, of course. And it's also about looking at the bigger context, doing a step back and see the whole, how to say, how big the topic is, and the context of the topic, and then see if the two people you want to invite, is that equally balanced or not? You know, is it just because you want an interesting discussion putting them against each other, or is it also a fair discussion? So I think that's something that journalists also need to weigh, and it's probably not always easy to do that. But I notice in the Netherlands, it's sometimes some programs are more focused on creating an interesting discussion, or like, you know, creating something interesting on television for the viewer to watch. Whereas if you look at the journalism angle, it's becoming less important. So I think this also just goes back to the foundation of what journalism is. That's my best answer to this. I hope that helps.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Yeah, all right. One last question. Sorry to actually pull you up, Sanne. It's any more? If you don't have any more questions, thank you so much, Sanne, for taking time for us after a long day's work. And it's been
my pleasure.
Very educative and very illuminating on a very unique subject, very unique topic. And yeah, thank you so much for taking time again. So
yeah, thank you, everyone. It's my pleasure. And yeah, please reach out if you have any more questions. And I'd love to visit your university if I'm in India again.
Sure thing. Can I share your email with them? So,
yes, please do. Yes,
okay.
yes. Yeah.
Thank you so
Good
much.
idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, ma'am.